Welcome everyone. Welcome to our next episode of Diversity in the PR Classroom. My name is Anitra Henry. I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Institute for Public Relations. This year, IPR and PRSA Educators Academy has rebranded the virtual discussion series Race in the PR Classroom to Diversity in the PR Classroom. This rebrand enables us to expand our conversations beyond race and address the challenges and opportunities in diversity, equity, and inclusion as they evolve for students and educators. Before we begin, I'd also like to recognize our sponsor, the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you so much for supporting diversity in the PR classroom. IPR and PRSA Educators Academy have been partnering on diversity in the PR classrooms since June of 2020. Today, we will have an exciting discussion on the impact of women on social awareness and change. So first, I would like to welcome Patrice Tanaka, Chief Joy Officer of Joyful Planet. Next, I'd like to introduce Cara Hawkins-Jedlicka, Scholarly Assistant Professor at the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. And last, but certainly not least, is Sarab Kochhar, Senior Communications Officer, Global Communications at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you all so much for being here and sharing your experience with us. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping rules. This is a Q&A type forum. To ask a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Once you're called on, please remember to state your name and organization. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the host in the chat and we will read your question aloud. Only the moderators can see your question, so you will remain anonymous. Today's session will be recorded and it will be available for playback by Monday. Lastly, please remain respectful to our hosts and others on the call by keeping yourself muted at all times unless you intend to speak or ask a question. Now I will turn it over to our moderator for today's panel. Irene, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. And thank you to our panelists for taking time out of your very, very busy day to spend time with us and certainly share a great deal of information. We're looking forward to hearing from you. So I'm going to start with a question. I think all of us have our own idea or conception of what social awareness is. But I'd like to hear from each of you as to how you identify with social awareness. So I'll start maybe with Cara. Perhaps you can begin.
Perfect. Yeah. So hi. I think at the most basic level, if we think about social awareness, we can kind of think about it as empathy. So when we think about social awareness, we're thinking a little bit about the education of being aware of an issue and then empathizing with it. So it's really a person's ability to consider the perspectives of other individuals, groups, or communities and apply that understanding with interactions with them. I do some research. I've been doing research for the past 3 years into empathy in communication students. So I see very much kind of an overlap between the two. The other work that I do, so I am a co-founder of a podcast called Starting Line 1928. Just dropped an episode this morning where we interview pioneers of women's distance running. And so we really are looking at the history of social change, our social awareness, and bringing it forward to now. So a lot of parallels there. And in that same kind of ideal, social awareness to me is really kind of an educate or like be knowledgeable of something, and then try to think about how you can act on it.
Okay, great. Sarab, what would you say? How would you contribute to the question?
Thanks, Irene, and definitely when when we think about social awareness, I think there are so many ways you can think about it. If you just look at the two words, social and awareness, the word itself describes when you're aware about these social social, but then the social is so wide. And I say that, and I request everybody listening to the webinar to pause for a minute, because when we say social, the social could mean so much in every context. Social, if you look around the world and what's happening, and I would not get into the detail there, but when you look at the social issues happening in the US, when you think about the social issues happening around the world, I think for me, social awareness is listening, learning, and recognizing that we are different, and also how we could really be doing something positive towards it. So for me, social awareness is not just that awareness piece. I think the action is so important in that social awareness that we really need to talk about probably more in this forum today, is about how do you listen. You are aware, you're listening, but then what are you doing about it, to bring that change, is that social awareness piece for me.
Yeah, I think that, it's a great point. And I hear the word listen, which I think is always problematic, because that's a huge issue in our society today. If we don't listen, we can never get to taking action or making change, right? So I think that's a great point. Patrice, how do you feel? What would you contribute?
Yeah, I almost have nothing more to add, because all three of you have covered the waterfront so well. But I agree with you about listening. That seems to be a lost art. And I know that I do more listening than I do talking, because that's when I can learn. And if you're interested in learning about other people in the world around you, you have to stay silent, and you have to very actively listen to what other people are saying. And I agree with you. Social awareness is one thing, but action for me is how we make an impact, how we, activate social change. So I'm always listening and learning with the idea that what can I contribute that would make the situation better. So anyway, I love that we're even talking about social awareness and the importance of listening and learning, and having empathy to be able to understand everyone you engage with, and even those that you don't.
Good, great, thank you. So given what's happening in the world today, and we don't need to, of course, go into, we can go into specific situations, but just in general, what are your thoughts, the three of you, on your role of women in leading the change of social awareness? Patrice, maybe we can start with you. I see your box lighting up. You're ready to talk.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm always,
I know.
I light up when I hear women leading change, because yes, we are probably best equipped to do that. Because I really see women as the caretakers of people and planet. Because we women can't just sit idly by and watch as people and planet, two things that we know are necessary for our survival, are destroyed by those, unfortunately, predominantly the men in charge, who sometimes care more about personal power and prestige. And I think women have been forced to become feminists and activists to create necessary social awareness and change to protect ourselves and our rights and those we love, and even people we don't know, which is a wonderful thing. And I believe that women as child bearers have a more visceral understanding of the 8 billion people who live on this planet, and that we are all connected, and that our responsibility extends beyond just taking care of our immediate family and those we know and care about, right? And many women I know, and many in communications, have been involved in activating social awareness and marketing campaigns to create the necessary social change. So yeah, I'm always excited when I am in the company of women and we're talking about increasing social awareness and activating change.
Good. Sarah, what would you say? What would your opinion be of how women are creating, or changing the movement, or creating more awareness, or leading the charge, so to speak.
Absolutely, Irene. And I think I would just go back to your first part of the question about what is happening in the world and how that's really impacting that change. And if you really start now looking at, especially the last 2 years, I would say, COVID-19 definitely was one of its kind global crises, but the impact it had specifically on women. And if you look at the data and the evidence on how much of the time women were spending on unpaid care, how much of that domestic violence and abuse against women grew during that time. When you look at even the decisions regarding the sexual and reproductive health that women can take on their own, whether they have the autonomy over their own bodies, I think all those things really grew so much in the last 2 years that you saw. And that's where I think this discussion has been happening for several years, and we've made some progress. But unfortunately, with COVID-19, I feel that all that development that happened kind of backslid a little bit, given all the other challenges that kind of happened along that way. So I think this discussion now is even more critical, given that how would we think about the impact of women after the COVID era. So that discussion has changed so much from what we see happening in India, what we see happening in South Africa. And those discussions, as you know, is front and center for many organizations like ours, for the Sustainable Development Goals for UN and others. But I think for us as women thinking about the impact on social awareness and change, we need to really find, and I would really appreciate Cara's thought after this, because I think there is a big role of educators there to think of research on how the COVID-19 changed the way we think about the role of women. And that's a very different reality, I would say. So I appreciate PRSA Educators session today and the way we are bringing this forward. But I see there a research or a conference paper write up talking about how that has changed after COVID-19.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Cara.
Yeah, so I mean, I will go back to, and I think we've kind of all said this a little bit, but I think with any marginalized group or marginalized subsection of a group, you become adaptable, right? You have to do it because no one else is speaking up for you. So seeing the role of women in social change, that our social awareness, I will also say just social change in general, is really important because we've had to do it. I'll keep saying historically, because that's the thing that I know a little bit about, is historically, we've had to push our own agenda because no one else is standing up for us. And so I actually think probably just because of the traditions that are passed down from our mothers, we and grandmothers and other women in the field, we are highly adaptable. We know how to organize. I had my son in the lovely fall of 2019. So COVID was really hard for me, and I will fully admit that. I went back to work and then got sent back home. It was a wonderful time. And I'll say it was very interesting, but I do think, as Sarah said, there is actually a lot of research, not particularly my personal research, but I know there's a lot of research going and looking at communicators, and even just specifically faculty when it comes to COVID-19 and what challenges that had. At our last national conference, they were actually doing oral histories in a side room, talking about our experiences to kind of collect data around that. But I do think there's a lot of changes that came with COVID-19. We did backslide a little bit because we were having to fill the role of, a lot of us were having to fill the role of educator of our own children. We were having to fight for kind of basics, not being put back into a situation where we felt unsafe. Something that I think a lot of people missed was that, until I think it was I feel like it was this time last year, under threes couldn't get the vaccine. It might have even been later. And I know I was like fighting to find a spot. I live in kind of a rural area, and we had to change like pediatricians just to find a vaccine for my 3-year-old. And we had to go get the booster, and we had to like drive an hour and a half to go get him the booster because it's still there's not availability, or they're not buying it. So I think there's a lot of backsliding because our priorities had to change in different directions. And the stuff that's going on, I mean, globally, yes, and also in the US with women's rights is a whole nother story. But I think, they kind of got us when we weren't prepared maybe to focus so much on the causes that we cared for. So yeah, I think there's a lot there, but I do believe that, as I said, historically, women have always had to fight for our own rights. So we keep moving forward. And then hopefully, any marginalized group, but hi, I'm a blonde white girl. So, making sure you're allying yourself too, to kind of keep that moving forward along those other lines of intersectionality is really important.
There was a study, there was a piece of research that I saw that, the cause of gender equity had been set back like 20 or 30 years because of the pandemic and, what women had to do in order to, fill the breach during this challenging time for their families. So that was crushing when I saw that.
Absolutely. And I'll just add here, sorry, I have a very interesting data point that I took out. I was reading that if the global economy could actually grow by an additional $28 trillion by 2025, if women were to participate in the economy the same as men, so when you're looking at even that global numbers and the economy, the role of women has constantly been seen as not just critical, but very, very important as it comes to world peace. There was another interesting study for the nerds in here. If women were at the negotiating table, peace agreements are likely to last 15 years longer. And there's a lot of studies that has been done to prove that if women were at the heading that political negotiation leadership positions, that's the kind of world we might not see as many wars and as many geopolitical issues probably that we are seeing and hearing in the news. So I thought I might just as well throw in there because I was reading that and I thought this makes total sense. So
no, that is why I believe that we must achieve gender equity. Because for all the reasons that you just cited, I really think that women as childbearers are even more acutely aware of the preciousness of life. And they're not going to easily decide our country should go to war when we could maybe talk longer, figure out how we can resolve our differences without having to resort to war. That should be,
We can talk longer if men listen well. So
but
that's the key there.
Gender equity,
if they listen well,
our voices heard. Yes.
All right, great. Well, I think I'll just interject with the one word that I think keeps jumping out to me that I think about the trajectory of history and where we've come in the last 60, 70 years. The word is resilience, and women are a resilient gender. And I think that if nothing else, that we will continue to push along and get through this dip in whatever we have lost. So all three of you have done work in the area of social awareness and change. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your own work and your own experience. So Sarah, maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your work in that area. What you've done, or perhaps what you're working on now, and especially with the foundation, that would be great.
Absolutely, Irene. I think when I look at the world of social change, social awareness, women empowerment, if that's the word you also want to use, because that's definitely what, when we're thinking about the impact of women, their role in it, and really bringing that change. I think when I look at my personal journey, I definitely feel privileged that, growing up in India, I was able to not just see some of those challenges in the equity space firsthand, but also being able to really be a part of some some of the work that was happening in the nonprofit sector there. I was working with the government of India to really bring in change, especially when it came to women equality, and also looking at that from the lens of the India-Pakistan relations at that time, which I think was fascinating, and I'll not get into that here. But, and when I look at, my work over the years, I think working with the foundation now, I think the focus on women empowerment, gender equality is definitely one of the key areas that the foundation constantly works on. It is an area that we have promised and made progress over several years. When we think about, what is the work when we think about women, when we think about social awareness, as a foundation, we definitely believe that the undervaluing of women and girls is actually the root of every problem. That's where we think, when we think about the economy piece, when we think about, poverty, when we think about other issues, climate change as well, when we think about science and technology, we think that, women and girls in general are undervalued, whether for their talent, for their work, for the time they put in. And I think it's really critical that as we really think about women equality, it's not the women who are talking about it, but it's also the men. So that's a key thing that we think we miss here. Many a times when we think and look at organizations, we would have a woman face talking about the women issues. We would have people or women talking about, the challenges. And I think absolutely, given that we understand that really well, we are the face of it. But for the change to happen, to our first question on social awareness, it's not just about listening and talking about awareness, but if impact or change has to happen, it should be men talking about and understanding that need for women empowerment more than the woman, I would feel. So I'll just pause.
Okay. So Cara, you have your background, or somewhat of your background, is in women athletics, right? So perhaps you can share your journey right now with what you've been working on. I did get the link for the podcast. I'm looking forward to listening to it. But perhaps you can share, besides obviously being an educator, what you are doing in that direction of women in athletics, and the invention of your podcast as well.
Yeah, so I've got a really wide and varied background. Sometimes I feel like it's very sporadic in different directions. So if we're talking about women in athletics, so I definitely have the podcast, which was a really interesting journey. I was a college athlete, Division II, a runner, so distance runner. You can probably tell from my height. I'm a little short, so always was into it. I really think sports really helped empower me as a person. It was a place where it was a bunch of women going for a singular goal and working together, right? So you always kind of have that really wonderful kind of feeling when you're with a good team. Yes, there's, some tips here, but for cross country, scoring and getting in the top, getting 5 of your runners to have the lowest score to win is always amazing. We're striving individually, but you come together as a goal. So I kind of had this really wide, varied journey to grad school. I'm actually a UT alum at Moody. So I have my MA from advertising there, but I had a lot of my background is I kind of got into covering a small sport, so an Olympic sport of running, and then realizing that women were not being covered the same way as men. And so a lot of my research and stuff when I was in grad school was definitely looking at women's sport communications. I went away from that for a couple of years, did higher ed marketing, came back. I'm an educator now. So when I'm looking at my research focused, I have the podcast, which is women's history. And then I have my lovely research focus, which is I mentioned briefly an empathy study about kind of looking at empathy from an undergrad's perspective. But my really big field of study right now is looking at women's sports communication, especially when it comes to name, image, and likeness. We saw a lot of testimony yesterday about how name, image, and likeness puts women at a disadvantage when it comes to earning money. Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, women actually have the most brand deals. They're just not getting paid by large collectives like the men are. So there is a little bit of inequity there, but there's been inequity all along. The podcast shows it. I have an interview with someone who actually had to fight for equality at my own university with women athletics. The podcast came, as I said, the podcast came around to a really interesting way. During the pandemic, I got promoted up to this position, and I am in a Facebook group called Fast Women. This Facebook group is fans of running who follow a newsletter. They put out a call saying, hey, we want to collect oral histories of these women pioneers. Who's up for it? I raised my hand. And so me and 4 freelancers started this podcast, and we have been running it now for we'll be coming up about a year and a half here, where we literally just sit down on Zoom, have a bunch of what we call freelance historians, and try to capture oral histories before they disappear. A lot of these times, these women did not get a chance to tell their story in their own voice. And we've seen the framing. Framing is very similar to some of the framing these days about what their running was at that time. But women weren't allowed to run the marathon, the Olympics, till 1984. I was born in 87, so it just still feels very new and fresh. We weren't allowed to run the 10K until 1986. Yeah, 86. Yeah. And we ran the 800 in 1928. There were false reports in 800's half mile that we all collapsed and did not make after the finish line. Newspapers spread this out. It was false, and the Olympic movement shut it down, and we barely got a chance to run distance until fairly recently. So I have a lot of interests that kind of overlap, but it all kind of makes me the person I am, so I can educate students in a way to kind of really think about it.
I think what you're talking about too, it just also gives your students a whole different perspective. Besides, I'm sure you have many interesting conversations based on, on all of this. So Cara, maybe you could put your podcast link into the chat. So if anybody would like to
gladly hook it there. I would always love to get more listens.
Good. Okay. And last but not least, Patrice, you have done so much different work over decades of running several agencies, and certainly, love to hear all of the work that you've done. But I'm particularly interested in sharing the story that you recently shared with those of us at the Museum for Public Relations webinar on your work with Liz Claiborne and domestic violence. And that's a campaign that was very successful, but was, 30 years ago, perhaps?
We started in 1991, yes.
91.
We ran for 20 years.
Yeah, yeah. So perhaps you could share your work with, I think that's a great example, but certainly if you have others that something else you want to talk about, understood. But I just think that one really stood out to me, at least. And I think everybody would benefit from hearing the trajectory of that story.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to share that. Yeah. I don't do PR any longer, but I had a 35 plus year career in PR and marketing, where I co-founded 3 award-winning PR agencies. And over that time, we did a lot of work in terms of creating awareness and change on important social and health issues, including women's economic empowerment and leadership development, literacy specific to women, financial literacy, breast cancer awareness and early detection, drug abuse, and yes, domestic violence awareness and prevention, among other campaigns. And my agency's first opportunity to activate social awareness and change through a client campaign was for women's apparel designer, retailer, and manufacturer, Liz Claiborne. And in November 1990, 4 months after starting PT and Company, we were invited to meet Wendy Banks, the late CMO of Liz Claiborne, about doing some PR work. And Wendy told us she was looking for a way to reburnish the Liz Claiborne Company's reputation as a pioneer and a map maker, which they were celebrated for 15 years earlier by being the first company to design clothes for the working woman. Well, 15 years later, however, many other apparel manufacturers were designing clothes for the working woman, and Liz Claiborne was no longer perceived as a pioneer or a map maker. Our team, led by my colleagues Ellen Lanicka and Maria Caligaros, came back to the office to brainstorm how we could achieve this when nothing about Liz Claiborne's current collections screamed pioneer or map maker. And we strategized that probably the only way to accomplish this for Liz Claiborne was to embrace a social issue that would help restore the brand's once pioneering reputation. So we conducted a massive audit of about 20 different social, health, and environmental issues that we believed would resonate with women across the wide age spectrum that Wendy Banks identified as the brand's core customers. She said Liz Claiborne's core customers were women 16 to 60 years of age. We almost fell out of our seats when we heard this. We never heard a CMO ever describe their target customer in such an expansive way. So we needed to identify an issue that resonated with women 16 to 60. And the issue we selected had to meet other important criteria that we established, including the number of other major national companies already involved in the issue, because we didn't have the budget to enter a crowded field. And the issue also had to have a strong national nonprofit partner that we could work with, as well as local partners in all of Liz Claiborne's 100 and plus store markets. We had a lot of other criteria too. That's why we created this massive Excel spreadsheet to evaluate every issue against all of our key criteria. And the issue that leapt off the spreadsheet was domestic violence, because it was an orphan issue. In 1991, there were no major national companies involved in the issue of domestic violence, as compared to breast cancer, for example, which had 35 plus major national companies involved in this issue. Domestic violence was an orphan issue for obvious reasons. It wasn't pretty, and no marketer to women wanted to embrace such an ugly issue. We believed, however, that if Liz Claiborne had the courage to embrace the ugly issue of domestic violence, that this mainstream apparel brand could help to mainstream the issue of domestic violence and reposition it from a hidden private family matter to what it really was, a public health crisis, in order to activate a systemic response to addressing domestic violence, a systemic response that involved the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, including police, judiciary, government, business, academia, educators, news media, sports and entertainment celebrities, among others. Now, in 1991, domestic violence was not being covered by the media at all because they considered it a private, hidden family matter. And women who actually reported abuse were not being helped by the police or the judicial or legal system because, again, it was considered a private family matter. And employers didn't see themselves as having any role in protecting and supporting their employees experiencing domestic abuse because, again, they too saw it as a private family matter. So our Love Is Not Abuse campaign for Liz Claiborne, which began in 1992 and ran for more than 20 years, was the longest running corporate campaign addressing the issue of domestic violence awareness and prevention. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, was co-authored by the Family Violence Prevention Fund, which is our national partner. The organization is now called Futures Without Violence. And the fund worked with then Senator Joe Biden to get VAWA passed by Congress. And the Violence Against Women Act was signed into law by President Clinton in 1994. And the act established the Office of Violence Against Women in the U.S. Department of Justice. Also in 1994, our Liz Claiborne client, Wendy Banks, who was on the board of the Ad Council, spearheaded the Ad Council produced campaign entitled "There Is No Excuse for Domestic Violence." And the following year, in 1995, the high-profile O.J. Simpson murder trial heightened awareness of domestic violence over a prolonged 8-month-long period because of daily national media coverage. And the cumulative effect of all these actions activated in 1992 by our Love Is Not Abuse campaign for Liz Claiborne in partnership with the Family Violence Prevention Fund is the reason that founder Esta Solar of the fund reported that domestic violence incidents declined 65% during the 20 years between 1993 and 2013. Before 1980, only 100 plus stories were written about domestic violence in the New York Times. In the 2000s, more than 7,000 stories were written about domestic violence in the New York Times. And turning the tide on domestic violence began in 1992, as I said, activated by our Liz Claiborne Love Is Not Abuse campaign. And as we anticipated, Liz Claiborne's important role of mainstreaming the issue of domestic violence made it safe for other companies to get involved with this ugly issue. So soon, the Body Shop and Avon and Verizon and the Wireless Foundation and many others got involved in domestic violence awareness and prevention. So this Love Is Not Abuse campaign and other social issues marketing campaigns that my agency developed and implemented is why I know that PR and communications can activate social awareness and change, and at the same time achieve clients' business objectives, because Liz Claiborne's pioneering and map-making reputation was reburnished because they were a fearless supporter of women on their leadership of domestic violence awareness and prevention. And the Love Is Not Abuse campaign is the reason I know that business can be a catalyst for positive social change, which I always wanted my agencies to be. I read that phrase in a 1979 best-selling book by H. Scott Peck called The Road Less Traveled. And he actually said that business can be a catalyst for positive social change. And, you know, this is what made me think that we could focus a lot of time and attention on social issues, marketing campaigns, addressing important social and health issues. And so this is, I think that has been the most satisfying part of, you know, the work that my agencies have done. And we did all kinds of work, not just this type of work, but
great story, Patrice, and it was an important story to share. So on that note, I think you know, one of the questions that comes up, and I think you've you know, outlined it and set it up, is there's a great risk when we take on projects like this or initiatives. So Cara, on your end, how have you navigated risk or compared the, you know, the risk to reward ratio of the work that you have been doing?
I will fully admit the other two women on this panel have probably taken more risk than I have. The risk that, you know, I've kind of navigated is probably the risk that I think most women have to navigate when they're going into the workplace, and kind of understanding when to speak up and when to do things and make changes quietly. And sometimes I am not, yelling from the rooftops, but the risk I'm taking is that I would rather see my students educated in a way to use PR for good than to use or to kind of frame PR as something that is a necessary evil. I think we all have a little bit of a tense relationship maybe with journalists. And so a little bit of, we kind of get talked about as spin doctors or as kind of a capitalistic enterprise. So really thinking about just being really upfront with my students and introducing these kind of concepts. Patrice, I love your example today because I'm actually talking about corporate responsibility in my intro class this week, right? And we had, a discussion about intersectionality, about talking to your audience in a way and knowing your audience in a way that makes you part of it and not kind of this false allyship. I'm luckily in Washington and not in maybe some other states where things would be pushed back upon. But I think that's a risk I take, is maybe an alienation a little bit when I'm kind of broaching some harder subjects. The other work I do, I don't see a lot of risk there, truthfully, for myself. I think it's more of an education, and I think I'm able to hedge it. And I think we're all pretty good at this sometimes with PR, hedge it a little bit towards safety if we need to. It's really how someone else responds to it. So yeah. Is it risky to put out the history of women? A little, but it's also like, this is their words and this is what happened to them. Is it risky to, do research in certain areas? Not if it's true. It's not as much of a risk, but as I said, I think of this panel, I'm probably the one who is maybe a little less risk averse and not maybe taking as big of risk as the others.
I think risk is all in the eye of the beholder, right? And risk is there. So we make the decision whether or not to take it. Sarab, what would you say in terms of your own experience with working and taking a risk, and how have you navigated that?
I think the concept of risk, again, to your point, Irene, lies in the eyes of the beholder. But also, I think when you look at the bigger picture, when you look at, that the risks that you're taking are leading to incremental change, is what really makes it all worthy, So when you look around, and looking back at some of the history, if you look at the role of women in bringing that social change, you look at the Arab Springs, you look at the civil rights movement, you look at even the Black Lives Matter, you look at, what happened when Malala Yousafzai really brought the education and everything front and center after going through all the risks and challenges that she had. But look at where we have reached because of those women and all the risks that they took. So I think when I think about risks in general, and I don't really position myself or compare myself to Malala or others, so I don't think I would really talk about the risk I took. But when I look at the risks that the woman overall took, and Patrice is such a great example as well on the panel today on the kind of work that she has done and led, and those are the risks you take as a business person to say, that's a risk I'm taking to really bring the change and create that impact. And that risks really leads to those incremental changes when you look at the bigger picture. So I think for me, risk equals to the impact that you make. And then it's not a risk, it's an investment, I would say. So I see the risk as an investment in the longer term.
That's good. Yeah, I like that.
And I would say, Patrice, I'm sure that you could contribute greatly to this, but just quickly, there was risk on both sides. There was risk for your agency and risk for Liz Claiborne, because there could have been tremendous backlash, right? At a time where, as you said, domestic violence was just not discussed at all. It was just kept within the closet.
Yeah.
So
and again, I guess like Sarah, I don't think of risk reward. In fact, my personal philosophy is that we're not here on earth to just take up space and consume resources, right? During our very brief time on earth, we must contribute in some way to making the world a better place in both our personal and professional lives. So I don't think of in terms of risk reward. I think of creating social awareness and change more as a personal and business imperative. And it's more about determining what actions for me personally or for my clients will yield the greatest reward. And with Liz Claiborne, yeah, it was nerve-wracking because we just started our agency 4 or 5 months earlier, and we have this big opportunity to work for Liz Claiborne. And the first thing we go back to them is that we think you should do a social issues marketing campaign, and we think that issue should be domestic violence. And we were terrified of it, but we knew that that was the right issue because it was an orphan issue, and the money that we had would go a long ways to making an impact on this issue. So we actually, because we had no money in our new business development budget, we actually asked 2 questions in an omnibus study that went on every week. And we just asked 2 questions just to make sure we weren't missing anything. We asked women 18 and older, do you think domestic violence is a problem in America today? And the second question, if you think domestic violence is a problem in America today, would you feel positively disposed to a company that was trying to do something to address this? This was in 1991. The responses to both questions were in the high 80%, low 90% range. And this was a time when the media wasn't even covering domestic violence. So you knew that this was a problem, even though it was an unspoken, unacknowledged one. And that gave us a confidence. Always back to research, right? That gave us confidence, even that minimal amount of research, to go and present to the chairman and CEO of Liz Claiborne and our client, the CMO. And they got it and, green lighted the campaign. But yes, it was kind of scary.
It's risky.
It wasn't our money.
And to your point, research, this is how we start, right? Without research, the rest of it cannot.
Exactly.
Cannot go. So Sarab, where do you see how women are going to continue to be catalysts for a change in social awareness? I mean, we've seen we talked about all these examples today of the great work that the 3 of you are doing, and the issues that we know are there and where we've kind of fallen backwards. But how do you see women moving ahead, moving forward?
I think there is one area that probably, as Patrice was saying, that it's discussed in the media, but it's probably needs more discussion in bigger circles here. And I think one of the areas that women can really make an impact is in the world of technology. And I feel that, as we really look at the world, when we look at the world of artificial intelligence, when we look at, all the things that's happening in the world of technology, women really have a big role to play. And I know that a lot of the times we see media and we see programs in girls in STEM, women in STEM, but how is that translating into action is something I think has more potential. And that's an area where women could be making a mark. When you look at all the tech companies around the world and how, you are seeing that the women should be taking more leadership positions there. When you look at artificial intelligence, when you look at technology, when I say technology, there is a big world of work happening around how technology is creating that public infrastructure for low and middle income countries, how people in India, in Africa, in other parts of the world are really getting access to technology in making changes even as small as being farmers on the field and choosing through technology the right crops, the right seeds, climate challenges that are happening. So I think women, if they are in the center of those decision making, would be such big catalyst for change. And I think that's an area that needs to be discussed more. And probably that's an area of a next webinar discussion we should have and really talk about how women in technology could be really bringing that change. And let's just think about, does technology mean AI in ultrasound machines? Is it AI in other areas? Is it, in all the ways technology can be a catalyst there? So that's an area I think is a big opportunity. Women are there, but can make a bigger impact there.
Yeah, we cannot be absent in the future and not have women's voices and intelligence and sentiments involved in technology. That's why I think it's really important to fund girl-serving organization with a focus on STEM and, and technology, because I'm the longest serving member of the Girl Scouts of Greater New York, and that is one of the pillars of our council. And in fact, because we've been very successful in this regard in other areas, we actually got some funding from Mackenzie Scott, but we could use more money because Girl Scouts is the largest girl serving organization in the country, and all of us are focused on STEM. We know that girls and women must be present and have input in our technological futures. Yeah.
Cara, what are your feelings about the role of women moving forward now?
I agree with the STEM statement, but as someone who, depends on enrollment in the communications college, maybe not as much. I love STEM, but I do think that is a role in technology, and I think actually communicators in general need to have a role in technology. We see thoughts about not really like developing technology without an audience in mind. And then it skews maybe towards the fundamental bias of white and male. And so I think having communications, having communicators and having women in that field are there. I'm also always I'm the only person who went into liberal arts, and both my sisters are in STEM. So it's always one of those things where I'm like, oh yes, STEM, my sisters who are building rockets. But I will also say something I am seeing on, and I think it's really kind of inspirational on a lower level, is our students, especially our female students, do care about social issues. They care about climate change. They care about their standing in the world. And, I've heard so much about slow fashion in the past year and a half. It's been, very interesting. I think what we're going to maybe see is definitely a use of personal brand to promote causes. So I'm literally in the middle of coding, and not like computer coding, but like looking at and researching women and men using their name, image, and likeness for certain aspects and how they're using it, what they look like, etc. And we are seeing women athletes, women in general, influencers really kind of use that personal branding in a more one-on-one way to elevate their profile, but to do some social awareness, right? So we are seeing, I think, a little bit more personal branding come in to maybe what we're thinking about social change. And I think we'll continue to see that. Our world has gotten bigger, but it's also gotten smaller because it's literally this phone. And TikTok has a lot of interesting things that are happening. There's a lot of conversation there in general, but when it comes to kind of these causes, a lot is happening social media wise and smaller in people's hands.
Great. So a question for all three of you, but and you kind of touched on this in this last discussion, but Sarab, what is the one thing that you think is really being done right, and what is the one thing that we really need to focus on that we're not?
I think one thing that's being done right, and again, I would say that is thanks to the technology again. And when I say technology, is the use of social media over the several years of how we are able to create that opportunity and voice for the women to raise these issues is something that's being done right. If you look at, even the example Patrice was giving in 1991, it was all based on what the media is covering and what you would get from an omnibus survey that you would know and hear about, but look at the world now in 2023. all the things that are becoming viral or are becoming issues are really thanks to the technology that's connecting the worlds. The Arab Spring was one of the biggest examples of how technology brought that forward. And there are numerous examples we could go on and on. So I think one thing that's being done right is the use of technology to have that voice and the opportunity for issues around the social issues. And what could be done right is, again, the same answer. I think the proper use of technology to advance those issues and make a change is an opportunity that could be done right. We are raising the voices, we are creating the noise, but how does that turn into action and we make an impact is that missing link, which probably not a lot of issues has kind of sought that answer for. So I would say technology is the biggest thing that's happening, which is right, but that's also the way where we need to find more answers for.
Okay. Cara, what do you think? The one thing we're doing right and the one thing that we really need to focus on.
I think, so let's go to the one thing we really need to focus on, and then I'll go back to what we're doing right, because I think we're doing a lot right. And so it's hard for me to narrow that. But something I think we do need to focus on is creating space for everybody at the table. I know in my students, sometimes they don't feel like their voice is important, and it takes a while. Gen Z is very interesting. They've had to go through a lot. We've all had to go through a lot, but they've had a very interesting kind of experience. And so oftentimes they'll be trying to do volunteer work or do these nonprofits or kind of have these ideas, and the seat doesn't seem available at the table. So I think we need to make sure we're lifting other women up and not blocking them out based on maybe age or experience. And I think we can be doing that a little bit better than we're doing. And, also empowering women to get to the table. I think we are done a great job of getting there, but letting younger generations know what it took to get there and what it might take to get there. You're talking about engineering. I actually talked to a group of students last week about personal branding, and they're called the Frank Scholars. So they do, they're mostly engineering students, and there's like one comm student, right? And as I'm walking out, I had one female woman comm student come through or engineering student, and just kind of ask me about the situation because she doesn't feel like she's making connections within her college and that she's too abrasive. And so we had a long conversation about like what you have to kind of do and how you have to navigate. So making sure we're making space at the table for those behind us and who have maybe counter ideas or different ideas than what we do. And I think we're doing a lot right. I think technology is something we can do better, but I also think we're using it correctly. The amount of social movements we've seen on social media is kind of amazing, and making sure we're doing it genuinely and not kind of doing that false allyship is also important. But I think we are doing tech right. I think we are gathering ourselves right. I just think we need to make sure we're creating space for everyone.
Great. And Patrice, what do you think we're doing right, and what do we need to focus on? And then we'll have a couple of final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah. So much of what Cara and Sarab said, I agree with. Yes, I love social media, and I can't tell you how many people my age poo-poo it. It's like, oh my God. I mean, if you're in communications, and you have these platforms that you can disseminate, and advocate for whatever you believe in, it's a godsend. And I love that young people are using social media, and they are, that's, sorry to be political, but that's why there's so much desire to suppress the vote of young people, because they are voting and they're going to the polls and voting maybe for the first time and with passion, knowing what's at stake. So I say, yes, responsible social media and using it to advocate for the change that you want to see in the world to make it a better place for all. And yes, Cara, thank you. A lot of what I do these days is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, even post my PR career, Pat Ford, who I think some of you know from IPR, asked me if I would co-chair the Diversity Action Alliance with him, which is a coalition of 15 influential organizations in the communications space committed to taking action on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, you know, this is something that the PR industry has talked about for decades, and I was involved in many of those conversations in past decades. But I'm happy to see, you know, people focus on action and, you know, and measuring and monitoring, you know, that action. So anyway. Good
So we're
stuff.
just about out of time. Actually is 1 o'clock, but quickly, any final thoughts that the three of you would like to quickly share with
Yeah,
our.
I would like to say to all PR and comms students and professionals to go forth and activate positive social awareness and change to protect our people and planet, because future generations will thank you. So mahalo and aloha, please do that.
Cara or Sarab, any other quick final thoughts before we adjourn?
I'll just say, I think we're going to see, I'm very excited about the future. And I will say this as like an educator who's in the classroom at least 3 days a week, only a Monday, Wednesday, Friday teacher. I'm really excited to see what happens. I think more than ever, we are seeing students passionate about this and making sure that we're teaching students how to be involved and making sure that there's not kind of this gap in their knowledge of how to do things properly. I think we'll see a lot of good things come of that. And, you know, making sure as educators, as people in the workplace, that we're mentoring and explaining and understanding different viewpoints. So yeah, we're not just doing, you know, the black square one day and then taking it down the next day, and making sure we're like telling them that you have to have that action. And I think if I take anything from this conversation, besides all these great quotes that I keep putting in the chat, is action. Like, yes, let's do it. Let's think about it. Let's discuss it. Let's have the social awareness, but let's also make sure we're doing social change on the other end of it.
Well, as well. And Sarah, what's your final comment?
I would say I'm really excited for what is going to come in, you know, as many outcomes of many discussions like these. But I think one thing that I read and I really found that very inspiring was that when you give women and girls an equal chance, it creates something greater for everyone. So I think it's giving that equal, but that's really leading to that greater in the society, greater in the economy. And I think that's what we are all striving for. We are definitely striving for a happier world, a peaceful world, you know, and thanks for this opportunity today. And I'm really excited, as I said so.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for this wonderful, wonderful discussion today. I think it was, you know, very inspiring and wonderful to hear your stories and your thoughts for the future. So we thank you again. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. We certainly hope to see you again next month. So stay tuned for our next program. So with that, we will say aloha and mahalo, right, Patrice?
Yes, aloha
Okay.
and mahalo.